The one that I think we should be alarmed at is what I call the culturally revolutionary decolonizing story, which has it that European colonialism, the colonial histories of European countries, especially Britain, because Britain had the largest empire, is a litany of slavery, racism, cultural destruction, and economic exploitation. Now, the reason that should worry us is that this is, in effect, an attack on the record of the West. And that there is in the US this 1619 project, which has it that the whole foundations of the US are illegitimate because they are basically racist. And the parallel in this country is that the last 300 years of our history, and particularly the history of our endeavours overseas, is a litany of racism, etc. And if that's true, then all the institutions that have presided over that are, to some extent, delegitimated. I noticed that no one cares about Arab Empire, or no one cares about the quote, vast slave economy, according to one historian, that the Comanche ran in the southwest of North America. No one cares about the Zulu Empire. It's only white empires. It's only European empires. Why is that? Because this is, I think, an assault on the record of the West, and therefore an assault on faith in the West. Because if it's true that all we've done throughout the world is cause misery, then who wants to believe in the West anymore? And of course, right now, the West is under threat, serious threat, from Putin in Ukraine and President Xi rattling his nuclear sabers over Taiwan. So this is the wrong. The issue is not whether the West has things to be ashamed of. Of course it does. But the issue is whether the West's record is sufficiently something to be proud of and to own and to continue, that we should have faith in the West. For most of history, empire as such was a completely unremarkable phenomenon. You can't find critics of empire in ancient China or the medieval Muslim world that they criticize bad emperors, but not the fact of empire. The critique of empire seems to be quite a late post-Christian European phenomenon. So you're right. It's early 1900s that Lenin, for example, becomes anti-imperial, although Marx himself wasn't, insofar as he regarded the colonial phase as a necessary phase in economic development. So if you add the kind of left-wing Marxist critique to a natural American skepticism or criticism of empire, then that does explain it. Although, as I point out in my book, America's relationship with empire is ambiguous, because one of the reasons the American colonists wanted rid of the British Empire was that the British Empire was stationing redcoats along the Appalachians to stop colonists invading Indian lands. So at that point, the British Empire was defending natives against colonists, ironically.
Is Britain, first of all, is Britain a racist country, systemically racist country, as the accusation goes? And is this linked in any way to our colonial past?
Right, so to your first question. First of all, I'm not an expert on race in Britain, but I can read. I can also see. So let's start with what I can see. I observe that in the last government of Boris Johnson, the last Conservative government of Boris Johnson, almost every holder of major offices of state did not have a pink skin. Rishi Sunak, Kwasi Kwarteng, Sajid Javid, Nadim Zahawi, Kemi Badenoch, I can go on. Right, so somehow in the early 2020s, a Conservative government populated itself with people from whose ethnic background was Indian or Iraqi or Nigerian or Ghanaian, whatever. And there was no discussion of this in the newspapers at all. It was entirely natural, which is exactly as it should be. So, prima facie, at first glance, is this a white supremacist country where we believe that only whites can stay on top? Is this so systemically racist that people with non-white skins can't rise to the top? Well, evidently not. Does this mean there's no racism amongst us? Does it mean that in some institutions there isn't institutional racism? No, it doesn't mean that. But the government's own report on race and ethnic diversity, published in early 21, chaired by Tony Sewell, called the Sewell Report. And of the commissioners, I think there were 10, all but one of them had a non-white skin. They concluded that no, Britain is not systemically racist as a whole, and the reason for different outcomes between ethnic groups, the reasons are various. And they also noted that usually at the bottom of the social pile are not black people or off-white people, but poor whites. So the assumption, it is often an assumption, it's not argued, and often it's made by appeal to the lived experience of black individuals. The response is, well, different black individuals have different experiences. The assumption that Britain is systemically racist, I think, is highly dubious. Now, what's that got to do with the colonial past? Because the story goes, and this is at the heart of the decolonizing narrative and its rationale. The story goes that we are systemically racist, and that our systemic racism derives from our colonial history, and the epitome of that colonial history was slavery, which was obviously based on a racist view of Africans as people who could be treated as subhuman, or certainly inferior humans. So what's wrong with that? Well, basically what's wrong with it is that there's no direct, unbroken causal connection between slavery in the 18th century and the present. Why isn't there an unbroken causal connection? Well, for a number of reasons, but the main one is, in 1807, this country was among a handful of European countries who were the first countries in the history of the world to abolish the slave trade. This was while Africans were doing it, while Arabs were doing it. The Comanche in southwest North America had done it in the 1700s. I was in North Carolina earlier in January. Went to the Museum of the History of North Carolina and discovered that on the eve of the American Civil War in 1860, there were 30,000 freed slaves in North Carolina. Some of them held slaves of their own. Right, so everyone was doing it, but in the early 1800s, this country decided to abolish the slave trade, and 30 years later, abolish slavery throughout the empire, and for the following 120 years until the end of the empire, was committed to suppressing slavery and the trade in slaves all over the world, on the basis of a mainly Christian, somewhat Enlightenment view that all human beings are equal, regardless of race, in the sight of God. So, on the basis of a vision of human equality. So that's the main huge fly in the ointment of the decolonizing story, that between us and slavery is a century and a half of committed anti-slavery. And just to add to that, I mean, the movement to abolish slavery in this country was, I mean, it involved MPs in the early 1800s, of course. It involved people in the House of Lords, of course. But it also involved, for the first time in British politics, I think, a mass movement. Something like a third of the population signed petitions in favour of abolition in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So there's that. Then you have people like Frederick Douglass, the famous black abolitionist, arriving here in 1845, and he declares, I find here an almost perfect absence of the kind of racism that I and fellow Negroes experience in the States. And then you have, scrolling forward 100 years, in 1943, when the US Army landed here and wanted the British to accept segregation, so black troops couldn't meet with whites in pubs or whatever, there was widespread popular unrest at that, and the Secretary of the Colonies had to protest in the cabinet against acceding to American demands. So, no, I don't think we are systemically racist now, and whatever racism lingers among us cannot be laid at the feet of the British Empire or British colonialism, because more recently and for a long time we have been committed to racial equality.